manches a mi hijo, lo lleves a tu familia para no pasar trabajos en el estado de West Virginia.
Ernesto Galarza immigrated to the United States during the Mexican Revolution. He was one of the first Mexican Americans to attend U.S. institutions of higher education. In this speech, Galarza, only 24 years old, presented an academic perspective which provides insights and limitations to understanding the average Mexican immigrant experience in the U.S. in the mid-1910s to 1929. Galarza's personal experiences as a Mexican immigrant in urban centers and in seasonal labor inform and comprise the majority of this film. Galarza made his voice heard because in 1929, conversations in mainstream U.S. culture focused on immigration from Mexico, largely based on these stereotypes. Spanish heritage stereotypes supported immigration from Mexico as an ideal labor source. The stereotype of the Mexican problem, popularized in the 1920s, supported racial arguments against immigration from Mexico. These perspectives played an important role in the daily lives of Mexican immigrants in the U.S. Descriptions of race prejudice appear as such throughout the film. Workers labeled as Mexicans were hired in large groups for undesirable, temporary work. These Mexican labor groups were segregated from other labor groups and received lower wages for the same work. The imbalance in the wage scale set the labor groups in competition with one another. The labor wages from one of these seasonal jobs was not enough to provide a subsistence living year-round. The migrant stream offered employment opportunities with each agricultural and industrial season. The stream was not a coordinated migration of labor to employment positions. Individuals and entire families migrated, and most had to pay for transportation themselves. Seasonal jobs also meant unemployment and job searching at the end of a given season. The families without work continued along the seasonal migration stream or headed towards an urban area in search of employment. Mexican immigrant neighborhoods and communities served as job information sites. Galarza described how there seemed to be more men than there are jobs, and women in the hundreds looked for work with too few opportunities. Urban work provided more stable living and income than seasonal migration. Unemployment caused Mexican immigrants to continue seasonal migration, agricultural or industrial, in search of work. Mexican immigrants were generally not able to bargain or to leave for better work conditions and wages due to the precariousness of the job. The distribution of the labor supply was inadequate. Contractors meant to connect the worker and the work. These contractors did not provide information about wages, living conditions, the cost of meals, or the payment schedule before laborers arrived at the camp. In camp, laborers owed the cost of transportation, had no means of returning to their starting location, and had no money for food. Galarza recalled how arguments over working conditions were settled in favor of the boss. Employers controlled more than working conditions, hence the standard of living that Galarza said the American worker regarded with contempt and alarm. Mexican labor camps were segregated from other camps. Galarza described the irrigation ditch of a labor camp as the water supply for cooking, drinking, laundering, and bathing. This segregation in farm housing extended into residential areas. Colonias, communities of Mexican immigrants, were placed in specific areas, generally outside of town, based on growers or town interests. These colonias were not included in city municipal services, so they had varying degrees of electricity, running water, waste, sanitation, and heat. The segregation in wages and housing sometimes manifested in segregated schools for Mexican children. Many Mexican schools emphasized vocational studies and did not encourage Spanish literacy. Mexican schools' academic calendar and school day lengths varied to allow child labor to continue during harvests. During the 1920s, most schools encouraged Americanization. This movement was discrimination in education, and it resulted in the loss of Mexican culture for Mexican children. Galarza's description of education focused on cultural loss within second-generation immigrants in public schools. He focused on culture through generations because his own education was positive and multicultural, not the average experience. Ernesto Galarza's speech and life experiences present an informed description and explanation of Mexican immigrant life in the U.S., with limitations concerning race prejudice and education. This description is almost a century old. How much would you say has changed over the past century for Mexican immigrants?
Cuando yo venía en camino, son poesías de un mexicano nombradas por Contestino. Ya con esta me despido, con mi sombrero en las manos y mis fieles compañeros.